So if we're given as economic agents, interchangeable units, as credit instruments or demand centres, then can we look at money in a completely different way, and so look at the development of crypto in a way that's outside the way how people speak the virtues of its use, or this development as being somehow a way to overcome, say, parasites that we are infected with. What's the nature of the disease that gives rise to parasites? So usually when people look at, say, Bitcoin as the principal, say, means of addressing this parasitism, do they ever address the nature of that spiritual disease? And so if they don't, then the way how people frame the novelty of the technology does not ultimately do justice to the spirit, perhaps, that it was conceived with, like, in mind, that aspect, that orientation or aspiration towards freedom. So we can look at the development of it along the lines of, if we're given as that principal product or a demand center, and time's given as a value that we clear each time we buy, it doesn't matter about the nature of the credit that you use when you clear the means of your production through the pricing mechanism. So if Bitcoin does not address what underwrites the pricing mechanism, the rivalrous dynamic, that when we bind ourselves together as so many buyers' journeys, so we have formed this kind of binding of collectivism, then how can it address ultimately the freedom that people are orientated towards is still set as a buyer's journey? And so you don't ultimately address the issue of credit. So Bitcoin becomes a means of exchange, and so you're credited the ownership of credit and not the credit of ownership. So we can explore the technology between the difference between the two. And so we have to explore that, well, if you're given as the principal product, and the only way that you can own your time is as the economic good that it's given as, and yet through legitimising use of a credit you are not the originator of, you create your subordination where you become instrumentalized or a demand center. Then how does Bitcoin address that reduction if ultimately the nature of the credit is not the credit of ownership? So the technology can be rethought in reference to that. So in this way, if you're looking at what's occurring now, with questions of credit, especially when the dollar system is coming to its end, and you have programmable money, stable coins and alike, crypto in general as a way of maybe preserving a failing system to maintain ascendancy, does Bitcoin really go far enough in actually being a way to facilitate that? Now, if it doesn't, I mean, if people get sold on the way how that they think that it does, well, then they don't question the nature of the truth claim as to whether or not time is of value. And so ultimately the buyer's journey that's been set for Bitcoin's use. And so ultimately Bitcoin just becomes another way to market the totalizing claim that's made on your life when it's given as a buyer's journey. So the difference between the credit becomes critical in order to reappraise the technology in light of the thinking that's necessary to see its potential outside the way how it's currently framed. And that's ultimately what we're going to explore. So we can look at, and the best way to do this is to give an overview of the ownership of credit as a principle that ultimately what is money, or a means of exchange, and then the way how it would differ when we rethink our production process, and so therefore the fact that we don't have a choice on the way how time is given to us. So what do you own when you are when the ownership of the credit that you use legitimises the totalising claim of a buyer's journey? So we never think of that, well, money obviously sanctioned the way how life is given, and so you're credited a demand centre. And so in that way, that credit just legitimises the principal value judgment that's been made, or the truth claim that's been made, that we acquit ourselves of. it's never framed this way because money is considered neutral in facilitating exchange. But through the facilitation of exchange, we discount the thinking necessary in order to understand what occurs through the pricing mechanism. So as I've touched upon before, that price clears time given as an economic good or the form of life of the consumer. When we use money as a tool for thinking, we discount the constancy of agency that is absolutely necessary in order to establish rates of return over time. Because when you're given as a demand center, your agency is the same over time. It doesn't deviate in any way. You're not credited creativity. All right, so what you could do to create beyond that totalizing claim, so therefore it works within a limitation of agency, and that is the constant. So when you discount that, then the nature of the change in reference to the credit is ultimately what you discount, because you'll always see credit as a means of exchange. So therefore the ownership of credit in reference to your time, which you don't question, but if you understand that what underwrites our interaction, so price, is the clearing of the economic good of time, then ultimately you can understand that when you discount the agency that you're not credited, then ultimately that would be the change in your actions from economization to creativity, that in turn would change the status of the credit from the ownership of credit to the credit of ownership. So we have to, because if we can only own our time as the economic good it is, that presupposes the marginality of our time and the way how we are beholden to it as an economic good, or the way that we are an actuary of a system that totalizes to the exclusion of other forms of credit, we could say. And so in this way, if you don't frame it along these lines, then distributed ledger technology and Bitcoin as the principal, say, vehicle for that will seem a way to transcend parasitism as a principle, and so therefore address ultimately the usurping principle that works through money's use. But once again, the usurpation is ultimately got to do with the nature of your status when you're given as a consumer or a demand center, and the way how proxies are used in your stead. And so therefore the way how that you recede from life, because you're never questioning the spirituality of compensation in this context, or the spirituality of independence in this context, because that's a given. It's a given through the discounting, through the fact that we've discounted thinking life holistically. How can you think life holistically if time's given as marginal? So you're always seeking a return, but the return, just as much as you or the whole paradigm, is predicated upon the agency remaining the same. So if the agency remains the same, you're always going to see any development in credit as a means of exchange, or a means ultimately to discount the change that you're not credited when you're given as a consumer, a demand center, and when you've been instrumentalized or turned into a derivative. So in that way, you can see that the development of Bitcoin, as far as the architecture of it goes, is addressing an issue, but it doesn't address the principal truth claim of whether or not time's of value, whether or not time is marginal. Okay, and so therefore what kind of life or way of life does it legitimize through its use? All right, so in that way, so if you think of Bitcoin as being generated or originated through a machine, ultimately it's not connected to a human action in any way. So it's ultimately disincarnating. It doesn't inextricably connect it to what proof of work. The proof of work isn't of itself a redundancy. The proof of work is not creativity. So if the proof of work that frames the whole system is a redundancy, then it's predicated of an impoverished understanding of what a human can be credited. And this is half the problem. So you need to, in order to understand the difference between the ownership of credit and credit of ownership, you have to look at the concept of the proof of work. So proof of work that this adds hashes to a chain, let's say, or add more to a ledger, if it's not inextricably connected to the animating principle for life, then ultimately what you're doing is that you still maintain a usurping principle because you're still not addressing that principal claim that's made on time. And yet people will obviously be sold on it because you can see all the ills of the current system. So anything that comes along that offers, say, a liberating kind of arc or line of flight, people will gravitate towards that because they can see the parasitism and they can see the leverage, the use of a credit that you are not the originator allows. So when it's framed along the lines of scarcity. But the principal issue here is that when you introduce the concept of scarcity, you're not doing justice to life without origination, which is not based upon any scarcity model. Because if the act of creation is a perennial wellspring, as it were, then the notion of scarcity does not make any sense. So we frame scarcity along the lines of resources. All right, so think of that. But then you've got the question, as we've talked about, the resource of time. When time's given as an economic good, it's given as a resource. We don't think that you've spiritualized time and that's ultimately a religious truth claim. So any notion of scarcity when you're not dealing with the nature of credit, of what you're credited as a human being, you're working with a understanding of life that does not do justice to it ultimately, because you're still marketing through Bitcoin's use the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey. Even if you remove all the parasites, or also it's whether or not you remove bankers, fucking fund managers, insurance, government even, you go real down the line of, say, capitalist, let's say, orientation. Well, what are you capitalizing in that case? You're still capitalizing on time as a value, all right? And so what does that mean when you do that, when you're capitalizing time as a value? Well, you can disinhibit what you're credited ultimately. So if you think of what you capitalize and value, and when it's predicated upon the form of life that you have to adhere to, so what you're credited, all you can go up tiers of like the tiers of social mobility, but ultimately it's based upon the redundancy because it doesn't matter about the tiers or where you are in those tiers. You're only credited demand. You're not credited creativity, because how can you be credited creativity when when what is originated is through the redundancy of a machine? And so all it does is it introduces still a usurping kind of principle to life, because the credit that you use has been originated through a machine. You're not animating basically something which is without origination. So you can see in that way that it can act as a vehicle between the failing paradigm and maybe something that would supplant it. But if you get beholden to it and you can't see that when you spiritualize time, you immanentize a spiritual disease that gives rise to parasites, then you're never going to address the actual issue that works to its use. So, so in that way, the only thing that you're still given as a demand center, and so you can't potentialize your life beyond that totalizing claim of a buyer's journey, and so the credit instrument that you are. So you're still monetizing, obviously, existence. It does not differ. It doesn't matter what the nature of the credit is, because you're not dealing with the principal issue. The differences in proof of work and the ownership of credit and credit of ownership. So let's explore what the credit of ownership would entail. What are you credited ownership over? So would we say in that context, well, you're credited the ownership of your time? And the answer is no, it can't, because the way how time's given to you now, it's given as an economic good. So it's predicated upon the discounting necessary to seek a return from where you are now. So if you are going to animate life that is without origination, how can you own your own time? Well, the only way that you can own your own time is if it's suffered a reduction. But if your actions are orientated towards a bequeathal that orientates that animating principle for life, then what you do is what you set in train is without origination. So anything that relates to that. So therefore, you can say the credit of ownership is not the credit of ownership of time, but it's the credit of ownership of your action. All right, so think of what happens now. Do people take ownership with the way how the world works now? If you're seeking a marginal return, all right, because you presuppose time to be a value, you're a credit instrument, you're a demand center, the world is a given through existential arbitrage, a risk-free proposition that you're orientated towards. That's what you're focused on. It doesn't matter in any kind of way, shape, or form. Then in that way, what the credit of ownership is about, it's about taking ownership of your actions, the responsibility that you have to, as a co-creator, to create the world. So you're going from something that is passive, Nietzsche's last man, to a co-creator, because what you do is that you understand the nature of the game. You understand that the economy, our economy, does not produce goods and services, as I always say. It produces the form of a life to sanction the way how things are given as a buyer's journey. So when you have credited ownership, you are credited the ownership of that creative action. Okay, and the creative action transcends obviously the discounting necessary in order for you to see life as a compensatory exercise, to always see it as through the prism of a return, of a compensation. So and you have to take ownership of that credit, so therefore the credit does not detach as a means of exchange, so therefore allows leveraging. So you need to explore, well, what does that mean? Does that mean to say that the credit of ownership means to say that how can you live? How can you find the necessities in life if the nature of the credit has gone from the credit, the ownership of a credit, to the credit of ownership? Now you're creating a world when you potentialize, say, the agency, that you're not credited as a demand center, and so therefore that credit of ownership is a world that you create with other people. So if you're creating what is common amongst other people, it's the way how you share that world. So it's a way how you share things in that world. What did we talk about? Or what did I just say before? That, you know, the economy does not produce goods and services. It produces a form of life to sanction the way how things are given. So with the credit of ownership, the way how things are given will shift, they will change. It will be a bequeathal. It won't be based upon the compensation. So therefore I will only do something, I will only provide something if I get something back in return. What you're doing is that you're creating a destiny for the way how things are given artfully. Because if what underwrites the way how things are given is creativity, then you're discounting, or what you're doing is that you're no longer externalizing what you are not credited when you're given as a demand center. You're taking responsibility. That means to say that the world that you create is creative. You're creating the very means of having things given in a way that is creative. So that means to say the way, the spirit, the way how things are given in. Now, if the way how things are given is imbued with a spirit, what's the spirit? Well, it's the spirit without origination. You're removing the leveraging or the usurping principle when life's given as a compensatory exercise or an expiation right. So therefore, you can frame it along the lines that were talked about. The difference between, you know, initiatory right and an expiation right. Now, if an initiatory right is to initiate something that grows, obviously that growth will grow without end, because there's nothing that's going to seek its return, and so therefore keep it in a loop. It's going to express, it's going to expand, and so that spirit expands. And so as a result of that, the way how that we make, say, gratitude contingent upon say our receiving will change. The way how that we're orientated towards goodwill will change. The way how that we're orientated towards reverence will change. All these spiritual principles, when you remove the usurping principle, means to say that they ultimately collapse, or you seek a kind of compression, because ultimately it allows an expansion, but they have to basically become interchangeable or indistinguishable, in the sense that if we linearize ourselves, then they're given as artifacts. But once you remove a usurping principle, they compress, and that means to say it flows through you. That's the endowment. So through that transition, you're looking at the nature of the proof of work. So if the proof of work is a creative action, then ultimately, and that creative action makes redundant the totalising claim that's made on time, so for the totalising claim of a buyer's journey, existential arbitrage, the actuary that you become for a system that maintains its control over you as a demand center or as a credit instrument, then ultimately that is the credit, that is what you are credited when you create beyond that captivation in order not to see what you externalize when you're orientated towards life marginally. So we can say and this is where the question of our existential status and the nature of value becomes important, because if we look at life marginally, then we're going to look at life in reference to values in inverted commas. And if we don't question the principal truth claim that time is a value, then all our values that we always talk about, this is what always fucking happens, are just value adds. But if you don't question your status when you're given as a principal product, it is a question of justice. Can you do justice to being born? Then the nature of the credit of ownership ultimately addresses the injustice of our way of life that cannot do credit to you, a human being, say the spirit that animates you, that is without, and the expression of life that you are. All right. So when you look at it along those ways, it flips the whole narrative on its head. Because if justice always is looked at social justice, and you externalize the relationality of it because you're only orientated towards causes that are marginal, well, it doesn't align with my values and all that bullshit. Well, what's the thing that always aligns with the value that you don't fucking think about? It's your time given as an economic good. So therefore you won't question your existential status is ultimately immanentized an injustice and ultimately an accusation against life. As I say, you're a fucking penitent, and so therefore you practice this bad faith because you don't know the nature of your plight. Then when you're looking at the proof of work as a creative action, and that action is ultimately going to address the spiritual disease that gives rise to parasitism, it's a question of justice that's existentially grounded. You become an earthling, what I say is the first earthling, because in that way you're looking at the transition from the child to the adult. So you don't become twice born through the use of a credit you are not the originator of. So even Bitcoin originates, you don't originate that credit. People that even might have the mining operations to do it, it's still a fucking machine. So it's not inextricably connected to the creative action. So it doesn't matter. You're still legitimizing the use of a credit you are not the originator of. The proof of work is the redundancy of a machine. And because it's the redundancy of machine, it means to say that you are equivocated into a machine. You're not doing justice to what is without origination. So in that way, the proof of work is that is doing justice to life, doing justice to the expression of life, the singular nature of that expression that you could be if you co-create with other people and you're solely focused on that one principle, that principle, say, goal. What would that be? To do justice to being born, to do justice to the earth. I mean, the earth is beautiful beyond measure. And yet, what have we set in train when we feel that we need to become twice born through the use of a credit? We are not the originator. We introduce that usurping principle. And so therefore you see credit as a value proposition because you don't question the principle injustice when we acquit ourselves of that transcendental truth claim. So in that way, you have a scenario where you've got the development of forms of payment that is always a means of exchange that discounts the existential plight of the person when they're reduced to the consumer, or when we've spiritualized time. And then you don't understand that actually, well, if you create a world beyond that totalizing claim, you're going to do justice to people because they're going to be able to come to the fore. Because in that way, how can you do justice to a person if what underwrites your interaction is the time that is cleared and that you each time you buy, and so therefore the person is always considered a means. So you instrumentalize people in reference to what is transcendent to the interaction. This is something that is a pan-cultural. It's right across the board. People don't realize it. And so in that way, how can you do justice to a person if it's always turned into some transaction. But that transaction, that interpersonal exchange, as I've always said, is subordinate to the existential arbitrage that you engaged with the principal trade, the Faustian pact. And yet, so if you cannot acknowledge that when you spiritualize time, you were introducing a usurping principle, how are you going to see the question of credit has got nothing to do with value, but it's got to do with justice? The only way that you can do it is look at it from the ownership of credit to the credit of ownership. And so the action, the animating principle of your actions, are you orientated towards a bequeathal, to a legacy, or you're just seeking a fucking return? And so you are discounting what you're yet to question. That is the principal thing that you need to focus on.